Welcome back. All right, so Unicircle isn't going anywhere, okay? Because now we got to talk about something called trigonometric identities, okay? Now we're just going to scratch the surface here, okay? In advanced trigonometry, you're going to go in much more detail. In pre-calculus, you're going to go in much more detail. And I'll go ahead and try to make some videos for those of you that are in those classes. But here we're just going to kind of introduce some of these identities, okay? So remember our unit circle, all right? Unit circle has a radius of 1, so wherever you draw a right triangle, the hypotenuse is going to be 1. And remember, sine of whatever that angle theta was the y-coordinate, cosine was the x-coordinate, and tangent was y over x. Now, a while ago, we talked about some other trig expressions. We talked about something called cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So when we talk about these, we can introduce these as well. They act very similar. Remember, cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So cosecant could be thought about as 1 over y, or the reciprocal of y. Literally just flip it. Same thing with secant. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so it can be thought about as the reciprocal of x, 1 over x. And cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, which is x over y. Okay? Now that's not necessarily what I wanted to get into, but I did mention something I did want to get into. Reciprocal. What this is going to actually introduce us to is something known as the reciprocal identities. Hopefully I spelled that right. If I didn't, it's your fault, not mine. All right. Now remember that cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, right? So cosecant is 1 over sine. It's the reciprocal of sine. Well, if cosecant is a reciprocal of sine, you can also think about a sine as a reciprocal of cosecant. So if you're ever given cosecant and want to find sine, just flip it. Vice versa, if you ever want to find cosecant and you're given sine, just flip it, okay? These are reciprocals of one another. And it goes the same way with cosine and secant. You can think about as cosine as a reciprocal of secant, or secant as a reciprocal of cosine. You can also think about as tangent being the reciprocal of cotangent, and cotangent being the reciprocal of tangent. And these are what we call the reciprocal identities. And these are extremely, actually, like every identity I go over today is going to be crazy important, but you're going to keep hearing me say it. These are extremely important. We need to make sure that we do have these memorized, okay? Sine and cosecant reciprocals of one another, cosine secant reciprocals of one another, tangent cotangent reciprocals of one another. Another set of identities actually refers to tangent and cotangent, and these are what we call the quotient identities. Now remember, tangent could be thought about in the unit circle as y over x. Well, y is sine and x is cosine. So you can think about as tangent as sine over cosine, which I did cover in the previous videos. Tangent can be thought about as sine over cosine. And since cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, which is x over y, you can think about as cotangent. You can think about cotangent as cosine over sine, and that's what we call the quotient identities. Okay. Now, those are all very important. You're gonna keep hearing me say this, but there's some identities that are actually even more important than either of those. Okay. And what we use to find them is actually the Pythagorean theorem. If we think about this triangle right here, this is x, this is y. We can use a Pythagorean identity here. We can say that x squared plus y squared is equal to 1. Right? That makes sense, right? The sum of the legs squared is equal to, 1 squared. 1 squared is equal to the hypotenuse squared. So you can simplify this to become x squared plus y squared is equal to 1, because 1 squared is 1. Well, remember that x is cosine and y is sine. So you can actually think about this as cosine squared plus sine squared is equal to 1. And this is what we call the Pythagorean identity. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and actually give this its own category. Okay, this is what we call the Pythagorean identities. Pythagorean identities. And you're always actually going to hear it as sine squared plus cosine squared. It doesn't necessarily matter, right? Addition doesn't matter. It can go both ways, right? So sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. That is the Pythagorean identity, okay? That is the Mac Daddy of Pythagorean identities, okay? But we can actually create more. Okay, we can rearrange this a little bit if we want. If I wanted to, I can subtract cosine squared over to make it sine squared is equal to 1 minus cosine squared, and so on and so on and so on. But I can do some other things with this as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this for a second. I can actually create other identities from this. And we are going to do this all the time, especially those of you that are in pre-calc and advanced trig. You're going to be doing this all the time. Okay, what I can do is I can actually just, if I wanted to, I can just divide each side by sine squared. Right? I can do that. I'm dividing everything. I can add 2 to any side. I can add 2 to each side if I want. I can subtract 28 from each side if I want. It doesn't matter as long as I do it to both sides. And if I do that, sine squared over sine squared is 1. Cosine squared over sine squared. Well, remember, cosine over sine is cotangent. So you can think about this. It's cotangent squared, right? Because cosine over sine is cotangent. So if it's cosine squared over sine squared, you can think about that as cotangent squared. And that's our quotient identity. Here's a reciprocal identity. 1 over sine is cosecant, so 1 over sine squared is cosecant squared. That could be another identity. Okay, that could be another identity. And we can do the same thing. We can do the same thing by dividing each side by cosine squared. Go ahead and pause the video now and go ahead and try doing that and see what you come up with. Divide everything through by cosine squared. Tell me what you get. All right, hopefully you did that. I'm going to go ahead and divide each side through by cosine squared and simplify it and see what I get. Well, sine squared over cosine squared, well, that's a quotient identity. Sine over cosine is tangent, so sine squared over cosine squared is tangent squared, right? So tangent squared plus, well, cosine squared over cosine squared, they cancel out and give us 1 is equal to, and there's our reciprocal. If secant is 1 over cosine, then secant squared would be 1 over cosine squared. And there is another trigonometric identity. Okay, so these are what we refer to as the Pythagorean identities. Definitely make sure that you have these 3 sets down: your Pythagorean identities, your reciprocal identities, and your quotient identities. You need to memorize that. These are very, very important to all trigonometry, okay? So definitely make sure you get these down. Make sure you're practicing, because we're going to be using these in special ways. And until then, goodbye.